Dear teachers, hi and accept my special greetings. I hope everything is okay with you. Welcome to the seventh session of materials development. In this session, I'm going to talk about materials evaluation, and I introduces and elaborates on the criteria against which you evaluate the materials. If I ask you to evaluate the materials, you may immediately go to describing the materials in terms of inclusion or exclusion of some sections. For example, if you see some dialogues in conversations in the book, you may actually evaluate it as useful and of high quality. But evaluation is actually very systematic, and it takes into account many qualities. And if I introduce the criteria and the standards against which we evaluate the materials, it may be surprising for you, because whatever you have learned up to now about language learning and language teaching, you can find in this actually checklist. The book that I introduced and I offered that you need to study is this one, from page I think 21 to yes, this is evaluation and adaptation of materials. In the previous session, actually I talked about evaluation and adaptation. Briefly, I talk about them, but today I'm going to talk about materials evaluation in its technical sense and in its advanced, actually, terms of conceptualization. Previously, I introduced materials evaluation and materials adaptation. About adaptation, I said that when the materials are evaluated to be of high quality, then in order to match the content of the textbook or materials or the exercises, and also the level of the textbook to the level of your students, to the needs and purposes of your students, you bring about some changes to the textbook or to the material. That's called adaptation. And also I said that materials evaluation includes two phases. The first one is materials description, materials analysis, and the other one is materials evaluation. If you studied this actually chapter by Brian Tomlinson in Tomlinson 2011, you study many things, a lot of ideas, a lot of points about materials evaluation. But I have tried to summarize the points I studied in this book and in many other sources and textbooks, and based on my own personal experience as a teacher and also as a actually learner. I have actually provided a checklist here, and I revised this checklist because in my previous checklist some of the actually criteria or some of the standards were missing. Some of the points were or factors were missing, but this is a checklist, the final version of my checklist. You cannot find this checklist in other sources, because in different sources you may find different checklists. For example, in Tomlinson, you can draw based on the points mentioned in this chapter. You can develop your own checklist, but this checklist I think is not a complete one, because some of the actually points I have included in my checklist are missing in this chapter. And if you study other sources, sometimes they are checklists for analysis, not for evaluation. I try to be clear about the difference between materials analysis and materials evaluation. So today I am going to talk about materials evaluation. If you want to do self-study, please study this actually chapter by Brian Tomlinson. You know that Brian Tomlinson is the keynote speaker, the keynote, actually the key writer and author or researcher of materials development, and also is a scholar of materials development, a theorizer and a practitioner of materials development, and all sources uses his ideas about materials development, materials evaluation, and adaptation, and things like that. Please study this text because it helps you improve your knowledge of the discourse, your knowledge of materials development and evaluation. And as I mentioned in previous sessions, when you study materials development, materials evaluation, you can improve or you can develop professionally in terms of teaching and learning. You can improve your cognitions and understanding, and also your practice in teaching and learning. But let's go to the checklist, and first of all, let me revisit the conceptualization and the meaning of materials evaluation. Materials evaluation means checking, exploring, and evaluating or assessing the influence, the effectiveness of materials. So evaluation necessarily refers to the effectiveness, usefulness of materials. So pay attention to the key concept, the effectiveness of materials on the users of materials. Who is the user? Learner and teacher. Both of them are users of materials. And if you want to actually talk indirectly about the users, the whole society, the parents or our fellow members, all of the people in the society are the users of the materials. They are influenced by the content, language, and also other content of the material. So materials evaluation means assessing and evaluating the usefulness and effectiveness of materials on the users of materials. So it has two stages. The first stage is materials analysis. Unfortunately, most of the people, students and even instructors, they think that materials evaluation is as the same as materials analysis. For example, if you ask them to evaluate the textbooks, they immediately go to see, okay, there are some conversation here, so this book is good for teaching English conversation or speaking or improving speaking abilities. So it is only description, it is only analysis. So you cannot say that because, for example, five conversations have been inserted in the textbook, so it is useful for improving conversation. Let me give you an example about a textbook written by Iranian authorities for junior and senior high school students. You see a lot of dialogues and conversation in the textbooks, in different units of textbooks. What happens? Are they real conversations? Do those conversations improve students' conversation or interactional abilities? They are only conversations for reading. So it means that reading grammar have been used for writing conversations, dialogues. Dialogues should be actual spoken grammar, a spoken language, a spoken discourse. So through analyzing the textbooks and chapters, that these chapters include many, for example, conversations or dialogues. So these actually materials are good for learners to improve their interactional skills or listening ability and speaking ability. So you cannot decide this, because you should evaluate and assess the effectiveness of those conversations or dialogues or the whole lesson. So description means only describing, only to see. Okay, you say that. Is there a provision of actually dialogues and conversation or listening and speaking, oral skill in this textbook or not? So you can say that yes, there is a provision of these skills. It means that these skills have been included in this textbook. Then you say, what is the length of each conversation or dialogue? You say that, okay, there is a dialogue for example, 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Then you can say, wow, this actually textbook is good for teaching conversation, speaking, because there are long actually conversations and dialogues. So if those dialogues are constructed and non-authentic, what happens? They provide students with distorted language, distorted زبان منحرف، در زبان درب داغون شده. The language, distorted language, is language which is learned by students, but never they are used by students, because they should not be used. The students only learn them for their exams. In the future, I will talk about authenticity and why non-authentic materials are actually dangerous or terrible for language learning and teaching, because they use distorted language. Distorted language means that you force a student to learn a language which is different from English, which is different from what they need to learn in the future course of action. They do not use them because they are actually the language features items they are learning are not what they should learn. They should use in the future. So they only learn for pass their exams, pass their courses. Okay, if you see that, for example, this book includes, for example, some passages. How many passages? 10 passages. Only you can describe the passages. The passages are long, the passages are short, the passages are difficult, the passages are, complex. Okay, so the complexity, difficulty, length, existent or non-existing, these things don't show that the textbook is useful. And after this stage of analysis and description, you go to evaluation. This is important. The second stage is important. You assess the effects of materials on its users and learners, and even on teachers. For example, your language teachers, you're prescribed a textbook, and you're asked to teach that. When you see that, okay, the textbooks are not of high quality, there is no genuine text and tasks in the textbooks. Textbooks are not based on modern theories of learning. Textbooks are biased. Textbooks are written to serve the needs and purpose of particular groups of people. They are not geared to the needs of actual learners. So it discourages you as the teacher, and also it wastes your learner's time. So it has a negative effect on your students' development. Okay, the question is this: how we evaluate materials? After analyzing, after describing materials, the units of materials, the lessons of materials, the texts, tasks, the content, the language of material, the discourse of materials, how should we evaluate the materials? What are the yardstick? What is the yardstick? What is the checklist? What are the criteria for analysis? Okay, I have provided you with this criteria. You evaluate the materials based on this criteria. Okay. Before that, you should know that a teacher needs to evaluate material in the previous stage. Before using materials, they should be evaluated. While you're using materials, while using simultaneously, a teacher should evaluate the materials. By evaluating, I don't mean a formal evaluating. A teacher who knows evaluation, a teacher who is familiar with evaluation and knows the criteria of evaluation, by teaching the materials or textbooks, by actually reviewing the materials, he or she can evaluate. For example, if he looks the conversation and he makes sure that this conversation is written based on written grammar, so he can decide, he can evaluate that this is not a genuine conversation. When it is not a genuine conversation, so it cannot be useful to improve students' oral skills. Okay, let's go to our checklist. Before going to the items of this checklist, dear teachers, if you remember in the first session, I said that materials development is a field of study because it has its own theories, it has its own conceptualization and understandings. It is a practical activity. It means that these ideas that I present here and you can read in the textbooks are not only theoretical points, that they are actually a checklist or criteria used, or standards or yardstick to practically involve in the practice of materials development and materials evaluation. And finally, I said that materials development is a means, provides a means for professional development of teachers. For example, you have studied many things about learning theories, teaching theories, theories of education, paradigms of education, or you have learned many things about cognitive involvement, affective involvement, assessment. Yes? So again, when you study the field of the study of materials development and then you involve in the practice of materials development, which includes materials evaluation, then you revisit all of the principles of teaching and learning. This is very important. You can use these things for your own professional development. The first thing, number one, when you want to evaluate the materials, the first thing you should consider is think about learning theory based on which the materials have been written or developed or designed. and to be used in the future. Learning theories. Let me be clear about that. What is the view to knowledge? Okay, by learning theory, I mean the first one, this. Okay, does the textbook, or do the writers of the textbook, provide opportunities for knowledge construction or for memorizing controlled knowledge? Does it believe in identity formation or learning controlled knowledge? What do I mean? What do I mean? The textbooks which believe in knowledge construction, they believe in the fact that students should themselves construct knowledge, not learn or memorize knowledge. Remembering information is not learning. Students should be supported and supported and assisted to be involved in the process of knowledge construction, not memorizing information, factual knowledge. So if you want to have an immediate evaluation of the textbooks you have used up to now, or the textbook used for Iranian language learners, what is your immediate evaluation? Do they believe in knowledge construction or knowledge learning? Yes, they are based on memorizing, learning control knowledge, the knowledge which is known by the writer or writers of the textbook, the authorities or the teacher. The other one is identity formation. What do I mean by identity formation? I mean that if you're teaching linguistics to, for example, your students, the purpose is not to introduce some concepts of linguistics, some terms and terminologies of linguistics. The purpose is to help the learners become linguists, to have the identities of linguists. Who is a linguist? A linguist has a good command of linguistics, understands linguistics, feels linguistics, think like linguists, does like linguists, feels like linguists, interprets views like linguists. This is identity formation. If you're studying research, to learn some concepts or terminologies of research means learning control knowledge. But if you try, with the help of your teacher, to become a researcher, to have the identity of a researcher, then you're going to become a researcher, acquiring the identities of a researcher. So becoming a researcher is better, or to know something about research. Becoming a researcher is better. If the purpose of learning is this, it is much better. Okay. What is the conceptualization of teacher rule? What is the conceptualization of teacher rule? How did the textbook views the teacher? In Iran, in our L2 education context. The teacher is viewed as a deliverer of content, the deliverer of the content, the prescribed content. For example, there is a list of vocabulary item, or there is a conversation and dialogue. The teacher's role is to read the conversation, translate the conversation, explain the vocabulary item. So this is only delivering, providing actually materials. Nothing happens here. The teacher only provides and delivers the material, and the student's role is learning. The teacher's role is repeating the materials included or the text and task included inserted in the textbook. The role of learner is to learn the delivered materials. The role of learner is only instruction. But on the opposite side, we have the role of facilitating, supporting learning, assessing learning. Creating a space for assessment as learning. Creating a space for agentic engagement of learners. Providing a space for knowledge construction. Providing a space for identity formation. For example, the writing course. If a teacher asks his students, okay, abstract is this, abstract is that, abstract is so, abstract is such, and then you should go write an abstract on this topic. So what happens? He has only said this is abstract and you should go write. But who is an effective teacher? The teacher supports student learning. The teacher asks students, dear students, come here and let's write an abstract together. He sees abstract writing as a joint activity in which both the teacher and the student involved in the process of writing an abstract. He provides comments. He supports when the writer is writing, the student is writing. He is part of the writing process. And then independent writing. Here the students write, the teachers support. But the supporting actually, or assistance here is different. He removes gradually the amount and quality of assistance. Okay, so I mean that most of the teachers in our context only deliver materials. They instruct. But teachers should be collaborators, the teachers should be joint performers, the teachers should be friends of their students, the teachers should be assessors and evaluators, the teachers should be a strategic assistant, and many other roles. Materials adapters, materials evaluators, materials developers. The teacher should be a learner. The teacher should be a needs analysis, analyzing his students' needs, analyzing his students' identities. Okay, the other one, conceptualization of teacher-learner role. How a learner is viewed. If the textbook views learner as responsible for their own learning. Responsible of his own learning. learning the delivered materials, memorizing the delivered materials. So these textbooks are not of high quality. Again, they should see learners as agent of their learning, as people who want to become successful citizens, self-regulated learners, learners who want to become reflectors on their own progress, learners who are self-assessors, learners who are assessors of the teaching processes, learning processes, learners who are critical thinkers. Learners are people who need enjoyment, entertainment, to become happy, to emotionally involve. Okay, the other thing, how assessment, teaching and learning, how the interaction between these processes are viewed in the textbooks. Do the textbooks believe in summative assessment, assessment of learning, or they use assessment to support learning? They use assessment to support teaching. Okay, you may have learned something about summative and formative assessment. Assessment actually is not a matter of time of assessment. For example, some teachers may use some quizzes, some midterm exams, and they say, yeah, so I use formative assessment. This is not actually formative assessment. The purpose for which you use assessment determines whether it is summative or formative. If you use actually 10 assessment midterm exams, but not for the purpose of supporting and facilitating student learning and your own teaching, or improving the quality of your teaching, so it is again called summative assessment. It makes no difference whether you have actually used assessment at the end of the term or in midterm actually time. So in the new paradigm assessment of learning, there shouldn't be any boundary or gap between teaching, assessment, and learning. You may ask, what do you mean by there shouldn't be any boundary, there shouldn't be any gap? Okay, so a teacher teaches. The purpose of teaching is to creating a space or opportunity for learning. Yes, this opportunity for learning should necessarily include an opportunity for assessment. Who is the assessor? An opportunity for students to assess his or her own learning, an opportunity for the teacher to assess a student learning and his own teaching, his own practice. So every moment by moment activities and practices of the teacher should be an opportunity or a space for learning and assessment. This is assessment of learning. There shouldn't be a boundary between teaching, learning, and assessment. There shouldn't be any gaps between these three ones. Every moment of teaching activity or learning act should include the act of assessment. Assessment by teacher and students themselves. This is called assessment of learning. So if you want to evaluate the textbooks written for Iranian junior and high school students, what is your evaluation? Whether you find some questions, some exercises, midterm exams, review, I don't know, process, review pages, review units, they are not actually assessment of learning. They are assessment, assessment as learning. They are assessment of learning. Even when they are used as midterm exams and quizzes, they are assessment of and summative assessment. Because the purpose for which you use the assessment is not to support the student learning, to facilitate the student learning. The purpose is only to use assessment. But even if your purpose is to support the student, but when it fails to support assessment, when it is not based on principles of teaching and learning and assessment, so it is not again assessment as learning. It is traditional way of assessment with the least positive effect. Okay, then in order to be clear about these things, for example, if you want to have a better, actually employ the modern view of knowledge construction, the materials should involve students cognitively. Cognitively means that students should think about the materials, the problems. Some superficial materials that they are previously known, they are axioms, they are trivial and unimportant, they are not about real life situation problems. So students do not think about them. Students think that, okay, this should be passed, this should only be done to satisfy the teacher or to fill in the blanks, something like this. Nothing happens if I do and if I actually avoid to do. The purpose is only to satisfy the teacher, to inform him or her that I have done, I have actually completed. Engaging in that exercise and activity, or reading, or writing, or speaking, a conversation, reading a conversation, should involve learners cognitively to make them think about the problem, to consider it as a real life problem require thinking. By thinking, I don't mean to be complex, no. Thinking, involving your thinking. There are some daily activities or everyday problems. They are not complex problems. They are complicated, they are simple problems. But you need to think about them. You need to think about them. So this thinking should be involved. The other one is affective involvement. It should involve learners emotionally. The material should involve students emotionally. They should feel happy. They should be anxious. They should be anything about feeling, emotion, affective. Okay, I think that's enough for this session. I introduced three factors that you need to consider when you are evaluating language teaching and learning textbooks and materials. In the second part, for the next session, session 8, I think, I will introduce and elaborate on the other factors. And if you actually revisit and review and listen to my lectures, Then all of these points are a review of all of the principles you have learned about teaching and learning L2 for English. Okay, thank you for your kind attention, and thank you for your patience. I will be back to you with my main lecture on materials evaluation and the topic of eighth session, the second part of materials evaluation. Thank you.